to our next presentation. This is by Jake Colloff from Harvard University. Jake graduated with a BA in Ancient History and Philosophy and a BA in Ancient History from the University of Auckland, New Zealand. He then moved to Leiden, where he completed an MA in Classics and Ancient Civilizations with a focus on Egyptology. As of 2021, he has resided in Cambridge, Massachusetts as a PhD candidate in Egyptology at Harvard University under the supervision of Professor Peter Del Manuelin. Thank you.
Awesome. Can you guys all see and hear me?
Oh, yes, we are seeing your conclusion slide.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
That's incorrect. No, we're good. So first of all, thank you very much for the introduction and for the symposium in general, for the organizers, everyone, thanks for having me along. I'm going to be talking about some work that I did for my master's thesis on the changing of the griffin motif from when it arrived in Egypt in the pre-dynastic period through to the Middle Kingdom. And I'm going to crack on to it because I've got a little bit to get through. So first of all, just a bit of housekeeping. For this work, I'm going to be defining the term griffin as any large feline with the head or wings of a raptor and/or wings of a raptor. This is sort of a very basic, but tends to be a common definition of this animal in the work that we do in Egyptology. And I'm also going to front this presentation with a general overview of my argument and conclusions before trying to lead you through my reasoning in detail and hopefully end up back here. So what I aim to show with this presentation is that from the pre-dynastic period through to the Old Kingdom, we see a linear development of a single griffin motif within Egyptian art. And then during the Middle Kingdom, this animal evolves into 4 different varieties of griffin. All of these varieties possess solar nuances and in the funerary context serve to aid the rebirth of their owners in the afterlife. However, each does so through its own individual iconographical nuances. So starting with the griffin and its migration to Egypt, it's fairly agreed upon in the scholarship that the griffin made its way to Egypt from Mesopotamia, where we first see it on cylinder seals, such as the one represented on the screen. And it arrives in Egypt in the pre-dynastic period around the Naqada II period. During this time in Mesopotamia, it was fairly common for such seals to show a heroic figure, either as a human or powerful animal, such as the griffin, dominating the fauna around it. And so it tends to be understood as an artistic rendering of the hero subduing or vanquishing its enemies. Now, this is important as we look to a few shots of what the griffin looked like in the Naqada II period or the pre-dynastic period in general. When it gets to Egypt, we tend to find these griffins depicted in very similar scenes, surrounded by other animals that they were either stalking or attacking. These similarities in the depictions tend to lead scholars to a similar conclusion regarding the purpose of the Egyptian griffin at this time. They are seen as zoomorphic representations of rulers whose power and strength allow them to dominate their enemies and maintain order in Egypt, which is reinforced by the fact that they're shown on these precious elite items as well. So now we're going to jump through quite quickly into the Old Kingdom. So at the start of the dynastic period, the griffin actually disappears from ancient Egyptian art and doesn't show up again until the 5th dynasty, with the exception of a single graffito in the 4th dynasty, which doesn't really help us with our interpretation. So we're going to pass over it here. But when the griffin does come back, you can see that it's changed quite a bit. The wings are flat against the body now, and its qualities are far more representative, generally speaking, of a raptor and feline, respectively. This particular griffin that I've put up on the screen here comes from the causeway of Pepi II in the 6th dynasty. And I bring it up now so that you can take a look at the difference between the Sphinx, what we have here, this human-headed beast, and the griffin, which is very similar but with the avian head. But we can see it's not just the head that's different, but also the body. These wings along the back versus this sort of shroud that we find on the Sphinx. That's going to be important when we jump through the next slide, and we're going to go back in time 1 dynasty to the Valley Temple of Sahura. On the right here, you can see that the head from this griffin is lost, but we can tell from the representation of the wings along the body that this most likely depicted a griffin and not a sphinx. So with this, we're going to deal primarily with the Sahura griffin here. because it contains that which is favored above all else by Egyptologists, which is of course writing. So the translation that I've made at the bottom of the page here refers to what's written along the griffin's back, ending up in what's under the tail. And it reads, Lord of the two lands, Sahure, who was given all life and dominion by Thoth, Lord of the foreigners, the Uwintiu, and Soped, Lord of the foreign lands, who tramples the foreigners, Sentiu in this case. It should be also noted that the text around the piece and on the top and down the side mentions Horus as well. Now, this sort of leads up to the first of my sub-arguments, because some scholars have used this text as part of a general trend to connect the figure of the griffin to Horus, who was a falcon deity and a war god, seems to fit the bill quite well. But along the course of my studies, I never really saw anyone connecting the griffin with Soped, which makes just as much, if not more sense, for a few reasons. So first of all, Soped was a patron god of the 20th and easternmost Lower Egyptian nome, right on the border of Egypt and the other, which many scholars who have looked at the griffin tend to agree operates in the dynastic stage of Egyptian history, in the desert, protecting Egypt from the foreign peoples, just like we can see in this scene here. But also we have this interesting interrelation of text and image in this scene, which I've blown up on the slide, in which the determinative of the word Sentiu, used here to represent the foreigners that Soped is said to be trampling, is made up of an Asiatic, Libyan, and Puntite person, as seen through their varying headdresses. And this corresponds perfectly to the Asiatic, Libyan, and Puntite that are actually being trampled by the griffin, as shown by the garments of these people on the bottom here. I would thus argue that the relation between Soped and the griffin is one that ought not be looked in the Old Kingdom, and perhaps also the Middle Kingdom, as we're going to come back to this argument in a couple slides. So jumping forth again, we're going to go into the Middle Kingdom, where we're going to spend the most time in this presentation as things get a little bit more complex here. For my treatment of the Middle Kingdom animals, I do something which I was surprised to find hasn't been done all that commonly in the scholarship, and that is that I divide the griffins up first by name and thereafter by iconography. So there exists 4 distinctly named griffins in the Middle Kingdom corpus, which brings me to my second series of arguments, which is that each of these griffins possesses their own unique nuances, which should help us inform us as to the role they played in uniformly acting to help their two owners attain rebirth in the afterlife. These griffins are found in tombs at 2 locations in Egypt, namely Beni Hassan and Deir al-Bersha, as well as on the pectoral of Meret, and on the magical knives of the period that I will mention later. Lastly is this sort of outlier that I've put on the screen in front of you. This quite clearly represents Horus in the myth of the Wedjat eye, as seen through the iconography of the Seth animal, the Wedjat pair, and the Bart symbol, which is associated with Hathor by this period, who plays a role as the healer of the eye in some versions of the myth. However, as this one is a little more clear, I'm not going to spend time on it. I'm going to focus on the other ones where there's a bit more debate and a little bit more ambiguity around their interpretation. So the first denomination of griffin that we're going to look at is the Tesh griffin that can be found at Deir al-Bersha. I've put up a modern photograph here against Percy Newbury's facsimile from the early 1900s, and next to it I've placed the pectoral of Meret, which I will argue represents the same form of griffin. But first I will argue that unlike the rest of the Middle Kingdom examples, which we'll get to in time, this is sort of a direct descendant of the Old Kingdom griffin. This is based both on iconography and the name of the animal itself. So the word tesh in ancient Egyptian means to pound, to chop, or to hack to pieces, giving it very violent connotations, which we can also see reflected in the iconography. The tesh is the only griffin out in the Middle Kingdom examples which has this really domineering posture of the upright raised head and the very erect curved tail, much like the Sahure griffin. The griffin of the pectoral is further shown trampling the enemies of the king in an almost exact replica of the Sahure scene. Interestingly, what we also have here is that both of these griffins are shown with the shooty crown, that is to say the double feathered headdress, which on the pectoral is encapsulated by both bulls and ram's horns. And on the Bersha griffin, there actually exists both bulls and ram's horns here, although Newbury only managed to get the bull's horns in his facsimile. And these are the 2 plumes of the feathers up the top here. However, there's actually solid evidence to believe that both the bull's and the ram's horns on the Barsha griffin are non-original, but rather later additions. But nevertheless, the shuki headdress, which can be shown with or without these horns, is quite curious as a thing that appears because Katja Gerbs has shown in her studies of crowns in the Middle Kingdom, specifically in the coffin texts, that this crown was linked on more than one occasion to Soped, as opposed to the Atef crown, which was more linked to Horus and Re. So this is another sort of convenient link between these griffins and the one that we find in the Valley Temple of Sahure. So moving on, the rest of the griffins found in the Middle Kingdom elite tombs are located at Beni Hassan. However, to talk about them sensibly, we first need to look at a series of contemporaneous artifacts, often referred to as Zalbamester or magical knives, though they're also called ivory wands or tusks. And so here are a few here. These guys are found in Egypt during the Middle Kingdom and Second Intermediate period, and they serve two very related functions. The first was to aid childbirth, as indicated by inscriptions that have been found on some of them. And the second was to aid the rebirth of the tomb owner in the afterlife. And this is when they're found in the funerary context, where we get most of them from. Now, in his 1965 dissertation, Hartwig Altenmuller convincingly argued that these figures on the knives represented members of the solar entourage that helped to aid the rebirth of the sun god each day. In a practical sense then, these figures worked in an apotropaic manner to aid the birth of a child or the rebirth of the tomb owner via sympathetic magic in which the protected person took the place of the solar deity within the entourage. Of particular note for this presentation is the serpapard, the snake-necked panther, the Seth animal found up here, the griffin without a head on its back, and the griffin with a head on its back, which is hard to see here, but I'll bring up a facsimile of this later, which makes it more clear, because all these animals are going to show up in the following slides. So like many scholars before me, the reason I highlight these knives is because the figures on them can be connected to the griffins at Beni Hassan. Here we see two scenes from the tombs of Bakit III and Keti, which both place the griffin between the figures of the Seth animal and serpapard, which are also found on these knives. These griffins are both given the name Sefer, for which the etymology is not 100% certain, though Morins and Skorch have connected it to the word Seref, meaning to be warm or to be hot, which is based on a passage from the coffin texts in which the term Seref is used with a four-legged animal determinative. This understanding, especially in connection to the context of the figures around it, would work well with the idea of this griffin as part of the solar entourage, acting in these tombs in the same way that they do on the knives, and helping to protect the tomb owner in an apotropaic manner with regards to the rebirth in the afterlife. So moving on, we have the second griffin, which I've followed Susanna Voss's reading for as Tepti Ijibwi, meaning first of the two banks, foremost of the two banks. So this griffin is also present on the magical knives, but it's differentiated from the Sefer griffin due to this head between its wings and of course the different name. Because it's also present on the knives, it's fair to assume that it serves a similar purpose to the Sefer through its apotropaic qualities and its role in the solar entourage. So the question really becomes, what is the purpose of the head? And how is this griffin differentiated from the Sefer griffin? A possible answer to this question was actually posed in a somewhat offhanded comment by Eric Hornung in his 1963 volume Das Amduat. He remarked that a particular snake with the head and torso of a man coming out of it reminded him of the griffins from the knives. So I've brought up a couple instances of this here. Now, two quite clear objections come to mind when associating these figures with one another. The first is that the former was a griffin and the latter a snake, quite a big visual difference. And the second is that these examples here are all from the New Kingdom, as opposed to the tombs, which were Middle Kingdom, and the knives, which were Middle Kingdom and Second Intermediate period. So to start with the latter of these issues, some work has been done in the last decade by the likes of Joshua Robertson and Eva Lipte on connecting figures from these knives to the Netherworld texts. In the bottom right picture on this slide, You see some figures from the magical knives, including this baboon with the knife and this cow deity with a knife. It may be a little small, I apologize. But you see these guys guarding the doors to the afterlife. On the middle right of the screen then, with the red box around it, you find, again, some of these deities from the knives, such as the hippo, the frog, and the cow demons, together with this winged snake. So this is the being that Hornung's talking about, that he's connecting to the griffin. So it seems that one way or another, these demons from the knives did in fact manage to integrate themselves into the later netherworld texts, leaving us with the question of whether the snake is actually a later form of the griffin, which is a much harder one to answer, as we of course have nothing telling us specifically of this transition. However, we do have the snake associated with the Tsavo deities in this middle right image. It's then certainly worth looking at the context in which the snake is found in the Amduat texts. So on the whole, this being tends to come from the 11th hour of the Amduat, and the text surrounding the scene can be seen on the slide. So it reads, he, the snake, that is, exists in this fashion. When the god calls to him, the image of Atum comes forth from his back. As the god referred to in this passage is the sun god, we can then understand the figure rising from its back as this image of Atum, which rises from the snake's body when in proximity and at the call of the solar deity. While this connection is somewhat tenuous then, perhaps the best way to understand the Tepti Ijibwe at the moment is likely as the beast of the solar entourage, whose body contains the image of Atum, or perhaps more likely a proto-form thereof, which rises from the beast when in proximity and at the call of the sun god. And so lastly, we have our fourth type of griffin, the Sargat griffin, found both at Beni Hassan and Deir el-Bersha, although unfortunately the Deir el-Bersha version has been destroyed since this facsimile was made by Percy Newbery over 125 years ago. That is this facsimile here. This griffin also seems to be the greatest outlier of the Middle Kingdom griffins that I look at as a whole, as instead of being portrayed in a hunting scene as the other ones were, it's placed right in front of the Tumona and his wife. Some have even taken this piece around its neck to be a collar, indicating that it's a domesticated form of griffin. Nevertheless, what we also see here is completely different iconography, with this griffin having large swollen teats and a lotus tail. This is a great first indicator as to the purpose of the animal, as both the teats and tail again point to themes of rebirth and rejuvenation, with the teats having the obvious connection to birth, and in ancient Egypt, the solar and rejuvenative qualities of the lotus are quite well attested, having formed likely due to the plant's opening with the sun's rising and closing with its setting each day. Some scholars have also connected this being to the nurse, singer, and harpist that appear behind the Tumona in this depiction as being two pieces that were originally part of an earlier scene before it was changed to what we see now, and these two bits were integrated in. The musicians here are then probably comparable to those from the Old Kingdom, which allude to the temporary return of the deceased to this world. And while wet nurses are not normally part of such scenes, they do often appear in settings of birth or rebirth. And sometimes they're even shown holding apotropaic knives, although not in this instance. Therefore, the context of this creature, as well as its iconography, pointing again to the ensuring of the rebirth of the Tumona in the afterlife, but once again through different means. So overall, I've tried to show that the griffins of the Middle Kingdom tombs all work to ensure the rebirth of the Tumona in the afterlife. However, as this can probably be said of many or most scenes that you find in tombs in general, the devil here really does lie in the details and the nuanced different ways through which these separate griffins achieve the same goal. Going back to the pre-dynastic period, we have a single form of griffin that acts as a zoomorphic representation of the ruler, whose power and strength allow them to dominate their enemies and maintain order within Egypt. In the Old Kingdom, the griffin retains its domineering connotations, but it's aimed more towards foreign entities outside of Egypt, as shown through the scene from Sahu-Rezali Temple, and also the connection of Horus, Thoth, and Soped, who all act in various forms as border deities. It also must be said that the connection specifically with Soped at this time is one that cannot be overlooked due to the interplay of text and image in the Sahu-Re scene. In the Middle Kingdom, only one griffin acts in the same way as the Sahu-Re griffin, and that is the Tesh at Bersha, whose name and iconography match extremely well with this Old Kingdom ancestor. This griffin is also depicted with the shooty crown, which in the funerary literature of the time is connected with Soped, adding an extra layer of connection. This appears also to be the griffin that we find on the pectoral of Merorat. And then we have, I guess we can say, 3 newer forms of griffin, 2 of which appear on the contemporary magical knives at the time, that is the Sefer and the Tepti Ijibwe. Both of these seem to be related to the solar entourage that ensures the rebirth of the sun god and sympathetically the tomb owner in the tombs. The difference between these two, however, can be found both in their names and iconography. The Tepti Ijibwe has a head protruding from its back, which may well be a proto-form of this image of a tomb that can be found on the winged snake of the later netherworld texts, in which a number of the demons from these knives are also present. Lastly, we have the Sargate griffin, possibly a tame form of the griffin, which achieves these same goals, but through purely rejuvenative iconography, such as its swollen teats and lotus tail. And with all of that, I thank you guys all for your attention, and I will open up to questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jake, for your presentation. It's been very, very interesting. Do we have any questions in person or in the room? Oh, yes, we do have a question for you.
Awesome.
Hi, yes. Thank you for that presentation. I've just got a quick question about the Sefer and Tepti Ijibwe griffins. Your conclusions that they were very distinct from each other. Is there anything in like the hieroglyphs or just their presentations on the magical knives to imply that they could potentially be like various aspects of like the same like mythical creature, or are they just like there's zero similarities in like the language or their like representations to like imply something like this?
So a very good question, and so I've got 2 different answers to this question. The first is that there is a guy called Hartwig Altamüller, who I mentioned briefly, who very much has this belief in his more recent articles that these are exactly 2 different versions of the same griffin. He connects it to a later story called The Myth of the Sun's Eye, and he says that the griffin with the head on its back is the griffin returning with the sun's eye, and the griffin that doesn't have it on his back is the griffin that's going to fetch the sun's eye. My disagreement with that, my argument against that interpretation would take a long time to go through and do any justice. However, when I looked at it myself, I thought that the iconography and the difference in the names was enough to show these as 2 separate entities. Now, whether they're somewhat related is a different question, but that also takes us back to the second sort of facet of my question, which is something that I was talking about with a colleague of mine recently, actually, which is that all these beasts that I've grouped together here have different names in ancient Egypt and are different entities, and yet we cluster them under this single term griffin. And I wonder whether by doing this, we actually do justice to the Egyptian interpretation of these animals in general. For example, it would be like we have, conceptions of eagles and hawks and all these different birds. If we just used the word, if a different culture only had the word bird and they tried to talk about all these different animals and the way that they show up in our iconography, would it be doing justice to group them all together or to not? So I do wonder whether there are sort of subcategories of these animals and how they were thought of in Egyptian thought. And then perhaps within those subcategories, there may or may not have been a link between these 2 griffins that doesn't exist with the other griffins that I've talked about. This is an interesting question for which I have no answer. I wish I could look into the Egyptian mind, but to sort of sum up my answer in one go, I guess I would argue that these beings are distinct from one another, although they do share very similar iconography. But the head on the back and the name as two distinct differences, I would argue, means that we ought to look as to why these differences occurred. And so we must separate them in some way, shape, or form. But how distinctly they were seen by the Egyptians themselves, this is a completely different question, which is very interesting, but I unfortunately don't have the answers. But thank you very much for the question.
Any other questions? Okay, Valentina, would you mind taking us through some of the online questions?
Yeah, hi Jake, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really, really interesting, thank you. We have one question in the Q&A. Can you distinguish a particular Egyptianized adaptation in the griffin or specific forms of different griffins from its use in Mesopotamia?
Again, a good question. I don't have any specialist knowledge of griffins in Mesopotamia, but I did deliver this talk to some colleagues of mine about a week and a half ago, a couple of whom were Assyriologists, and they informed me that apparently in Mesopotamia, right up into the late periods, they don't really have a single unique form of griffin. They don't even really have a single term to refer to the griffin. There is one that the Duke could think of, which I cannot remember for the life of me, but it seems like the griffin in Mesopotamia, even though it was present in the iconography, it was less present in the language. And to be fair, it wasn't all that present in the Egyptian language either. We find, I think, the name Sefer appears twice in these two tombs. Tepti Ijibwe appears exactly once on a single magical knife. Saget only comes up twice, but it's on the two times that we find that particular form of griffin. And then, so most griffins do go unnamed as well, to be fair. But I can't talk about the later Mesopotamian griffins. Unfortunately, I just simply don't know enough about them. I've not looked into that aspect of the culture. I really just looked at how they came to Egypt and then the development in Egypt. But I'd say at that early time, it really seems to be that this motif was borrowed in perhaps not exactly a one-to-one, but an almost one-to-one relation of the Mesopotamian pre-dynastic griffin and the pre-dynastic griffin we find in Egypt, and then developed, I would argue, you can follow the development along Egyptian lines thereafter. But yeah, thanks again for the question. It's a good one.
Thank you so much. I forgot to mention the question was by Marie. So thank you. Thank you so much. We don't have any more questions in the Q&A tab.